Welcome to the FarmBits podcast.
FarmBits is proudly produced by the Nebraska Digital Agriculture team and hosted by the students at the University of Nebraska.
The FarmBits podcast comes to you each week to discuss trends, the realities, and the value of digital agriculture.
Through interviews with experts, producers, and innovators from across the agriculture industry, we hope that you step away from each episode with new practical knowledge of digital agriculture technology. Hello, FarmBits followers, and welcome to another episode of the FarmBits podcast. I am Deepak Ghimire.
And I'm Emily Hanson, and we're glad to have you with us as we continue our discussion on data management.
Today, we are joined by Tyler Nigon, a principal scientist at Sentera.
Sentera is a company that delivers agricultural insights to help optimize management decisions.
I grew up on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. My parents still own and operate that farm, and I'm still sort of involved with nutrient management, planning, and things like that. But after high school, I went to college in my undergraduate for soil science and became introduced to GIS, geospatial information systems, and precision agriculture was sort of up and coming at the time, and I was immediately interested in using precision agricultures for improving nutrient management and soil fertility practices and things like that. And so I looked into some different graduate programs, and I found my way over to the University of Minnesota to do a project on using hyperspectral and thermal imagery for nitrogen and water stress detection in potatoes. And so using remote sensing for making agronomic decisions. And so that really opened up probably most of the doors that led me to where I am today. Since finishing my master's program, I actually went back to the University of Minnesota to do a PhD as well, where I used drone-based remote sensing for nitrogen detection in corn. So switched to drone from aerial imagery, and then switched from potato to corn. Now, over the last 2 years, I've been at Sentera, where my role is a principal scientist. And so my primary responsibilities are to develop new products for our customers, analytic products I'm referring to. So how we take remote sensing imagery and turn it into value, specifically around agronomic modeling, customized modeling, and using different environmental management, agricultural data sources to do just that.
That's pretty cool. Could you give us a little bit of an overview about what Sentera is?
Yeah, so Sentera is a company founded in 2014 or 2015. So been around for not quite 10 years now. And we have three main divisions or departments or products, I guess, that products and services that we offer our customers. And we call them field capture, field insights, and field agents. And so I'll just briefly describe each one of those. And so the first one, field capture. So we have our own hardware, and so we design our own multispectral cameras and RGB visual cameras, and even have a fixed wing drone called the PHX that we have designed, we manufacture, and then we sell. And then the other part of field capture then would be our flight services offerings. And so for any customers that haven't made an investment in the hardware itself, or aren't willing to make that investment because it can be a lot of financial cost upfront, we offer flight services and project management for instead of selling hardware, we sell the data. We will go out to your fields, to your plots at certain times, certain growth stages based on your objectives, whether you're a research customer or more of a production egg customer. And we'll make sure that you get the multispectral RGB imagery, and then also the the analytics that you really need to be successful. So that's field capture. The second, field insights. This is where I find myself under the umbrella of Sentera and where I'm working. But field insights is all around the advanced analytics from these primary data sources. And it might be obvious, but Sentera with focus on remote sensing and aerial imagery, most of our products that we offer are derivatives of that multispectral RGB imagery. So different products like stand count, crop health, canopy cover, weed detection, maturity date, and then we have a new one that we're working on right now, and that is yield potential ranking. And so using maybe multiple measurements that come from multispectral imagery to provide an estimate of yield and then rank them. So then, the customer might know which plots, which maybe seed varieties or treatments have the highest yield potential. And then there's agronomic modeling. And so agronomic modeling is where I am spending most of my efforts. And I won't go into it too deep right now, but basically, with agronomic modeling is what we mean is a customized modeling solution for either predictive analysis or causal analysis. So this is where we bring in other environmental management, agronomic variables, things like soil, hydrology, weather, expanding outside of drone imagery and using satellite imagery. And then obviously all the management data and taking a multivariate approach for training and deploying a model to solve a particular solution. And then the last one, Field Agent. So Field Agent is our visualization software. It's a web-based app that allows our customers to go and visualize all of the aerial imagery that's been collected. So it's a geospatial program, so you can see a field map and you can see a map of your field boundaries and then look at all of the collections throughout the season. And then that's where we also provide access for any of the field insights, the advanced analytics that were provided. And then also included with Field Agent is ordering interface. So you can see the status of your orders, the Field Insights orders, reporting. So being able to export reports of the Field Insights, and then also there's an API. So the ability to download any of your data or access that data through an API.
That's pretty cool. I know I work with some drone imagery, just with the lab that I work with here on campus. So my question as a follow-up, when you're using these drone imagery sources to come up with your different, like your yield potential or some of those other services that you have, is it the same bands of imagery every time, or is it different types of imagery?
So yeah, this is it's a really good question. It's tricky to answer, and I think this is where we kind of get into the interface of some of these off-the-shelf solutions that are just pure derivatives of only aerial imagery, of only drone-based high-resolution imagery, and incorporating other agronomically relevant variables like soil and weather and things like that in. And so to your question about like, okay, which bands like are the most useful, or how are certain bands used for one solution but not another? So the answer is yes, absolutely. Different spectral bands, green, red edge, near infrared, will have different relationships with the biophysical properties of the vegetation, the cellular dynamics of, when that plant is experiencing crop stress and things like that. So these different bands absolutely have a relationship on the crop health in general. However, the different stressors and this faceted or this multivariable. So the fact of the matter is that there's usually more than just one thing that causes crop stress. Whether that is crop nutrition, and we can split hairs there and look at phosphorus versus nitrogen versus potassium versus sulfur, or a disease or weed pressure at any given point in the season. When we look at all of these different variables, then different bands will manifest themselves as being, quote, more important or more influential. And so when we look at some of these off-the-shelf solutions, yes, we'll usually make assumptions and say, okay, we're using this band, or we're using NDVI for this, or maybe NDRE for another product, and then even offer provide customers with a choice on sort of which avenue we take based on just what we know. However, when we get over to agronomic modeling, I've always found that the most robust solution is when training the model, consider all of the data that you have. If it's multispectral imagery with blue, green, red edge, near infrared, thermal bands, let's provide access for the model to be trained on all of those, and then let the feature selection process sort of choose which ones are most influential. And that would be based on the ground truth data that were collected based on your environment, your crop, your problem that you're trying to solve. So hopefully that wasn't too long-winded and that makes sense, but
yeah, I think that was a great insight into how or what kind of data collected will be useful in terms of getting the recommendations or making the data useful. So following up on the previous products, great lines of services that you highlighted before. So do farmers require any kind of special tools, equipments to use Sentera's products?
No. And the reason it's no is because we offer a flight services program. So if farmers are willing to use our flight services and project management services, they don't have to make that upfront investment in the equipment and things needed. And we will just schedule the flights and provide the field insights, the analytics, then based on, what's desired, what they want to order. Now, with that said, if that investment's already been made, or if a year or two from now, farmers want to make an investment into drone sensor hardware and like to fly themselves or have someone hired to fly, maybe it's a crop consultant or something like that's absolutely something that we support. Just one caveat or something to watch out for is that different field insights products require different flight specifications. So different flying altitudes, not all sensors will, not all field insights analytic products will be available for all sensors. For example, a stand count requires a relatively low flight altitude, high resolution imagery, and it uses visual imagery, RGB. So a simple RGB sensor is fine. On the other hand, crop health and some of these more spectral based field insights products require a multispectral sensor, or at least red and near infrared band to be able to calculate the NDVI from that.
That's pretty cool. To kind of build on that question, for research purposes, if a researcher has a drone, but wants to get one of your sensors, is there any particular features on that drone that would be needed to be able to hold your sensor?
Yes. So this is outside of my expertise off the top of my head. I have to go to a couple of my colleagues for all this information. But yeah, so our sensors are compatible with a certain list of platforms, drone platforms, and that's not necessarily to say that it's not possible to outfit our sensors on a drone outside of that list, it's usually that, there's just so many drones out there. It's usually that, okay, this it just isn't part of the short list in terms of like what we support first class. But if whenever there is interest of supporting sensors on different drone platforms, we'll make a point of, adding it to that list and doing some integration work to make that possible. But it basically comes down to payload. And our sensors are pretty lightweight, so it's usually not a problem, but it can be with some of these very small drones. Payload, and then the electrical interface to be able to read the GPS coming from the drone so that the camera gets triggered at the right time. Things like that are the important factors when doing that integration.
Yeah, following up on the previous products again. So farmers or producers, researchers, so whenever they are using the Sentera's products, maybe field captures, or particularly when we are talking now with you, I'd like to focus more on egg modeling. So what kind of data layers are you using to recommend farmers, and what kind of data layers are you expecting from farmers when they are using the Sentera's products?
Yeah, so like you said, this is a question that gets focused on agronomic modeling, where we're incorporating other management weather-based features. So before answering that question, I'll just maybe reiterate the layers that Sentera offers from different field insights, because a lot of these field insights products then will become inputs for the agronomic modeling problem. So talking more generically, maybe more around the file format and what that format represents, rather than a specific product. We tend to have two different types of data, rasters or vector, and the raster would be things like images. So it might be visual or RGB images, multispectral images, but then binary images. So this might be where all of the non-vegetation got masked out and we just have a 0 and 1 or true false. Is there vegetation here or not? And then those can get analyzed in a way where you can do different descriptive statistics, zonal statistics on your different areas of interest that then get used for features in the model. And then the vector data, these are things like GeoJSON or shapefile or CSV or more tabular data. And then, so this is what the deliverable types of our field insights products, like the off-the-shelf products. Now, when using them for agronomic modeling, I'll start off by saying, at a very basic modeling approach, we can usually develop train a model just based on that. However, I strongly encourage there to be some sort of ground truth information. So now transferring, with all that said, I'll now answer your question. What data are necessary? Taking a look at the objective that you're trying to solve. So let's say, for example, it is yield prediction, in-season yield prediction. So we want to make predict yield before harvest, and maybe that might be important for our marketing decisions, or maybe contract purposes, things like that. Might be obvious, but if we're going to train a model to make yield predictions, we should have ground truth yield data. Now, an alternative, if we don't have that, would just be, sort of train another unsupervised model where we don't have ground truth data to basically make up some yield data. So that response variable, in our case, yield, is number one, critically important for training a good model. And then after that, literally anything is on the table. This is a data-driven system, and so I've always found that usually the more data we have, the more robust of a model we might have. doesn't always necessarily mean a more accurate model, because there's a lot of caveats if I were to go ahead and say that. But when I say more data, I mean, and it could mean two different dimensions. The most important one, I feel like, is how many observations do we have in our data set? So when we're looking at a table, like an Excel spreadsheet or something, this is how many rows there are in that spreadsheet. How many growing seasons does this represent? How many different soil types does this represent? How many different fertilizer programs or crops does this represent? And when we go from dozens to hundreds to thousands to tens of thousands, that's really influential in our ability to put together a robust model. The other dimension would be the variables that are being considered, or the columns as we look into a spreadsheet. And so I already sort of touched on it, but soils information, this might be physical, like soil mapping from the Circo data set, but it could also mean chemical, soil sampling, farm-based soil sampling, looking at pH and potassium phosphorus levels over the course of growing seasons. Management data itself, so planting date, what variety or hybrid was grown, the application of different fertilizers or pesticides, fungicides. The harvest date is usually really important. And then I mentioned weather already, but looking at different weather variables, minimum, maximum temperature to calculate growing degree days, solar radiation, depending on the crop, that's really influential to know, how the crop progresses. Precipitation, obviously. So I think you get the gist, but it could literally be anything. If there is a variable that someone has a hypothesis or a hunch that it should influence whatever our response variable is, and if it's available, throw it in there.
Okay, so with the rise of technology and digital tools, there's a lot of data being generated on farms. As a professional working with data analytics, what are your thoughts on how this data can be better managed and utilized at a farm level and at an industry level?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I have a lot of thoughts on that, but it's somewhat difficult to articulate always. But I think I'll do my best. I think as an industry, the number one thing I think we need to do a better job of coming together and adopt some sort of data standards around these agronomic variables that are being measured. And now I'm not necessarily referring to APIs and data sharing and shapefile versus GeoJSON versus some proprietary format, although that's all part of it. It's all important. But I'm more referring to the cleaning and the organizing of data so that it can be used sort of out of the box for putting together important agronomic features. Now, I'm kind of answering this question from the perspective of customized agronomic modeling. A big part of that is having data for your problem, having enough of it, and taking those primary data sources, things like weather, precipitation data, or things like soil information, and then use it transforming that data through a process that I call feature engineering to make columns or make variables that are more agronomically relevant. And I can talk maybe a little bit more and provide an example about that, but I don't want to get too far off track on the question here. Being able to, doing a little bit around data standards or having data standards, and then kind of having processes in place for how the data gets processed, how it gets cleaned, so that it can be, truly analysis ready for doing feature engineering and doing things like zonal statistics or summary statistics is something that I think a lot of people I'll talk about in different ways, but it's really, really hard to do. And that's, I think, the one thing that we have to come together on to improve a little bit more going forward.
Yeah, I think that are some of the good thoughts coming together, creating some shared database where we can overall improve like towards productions and help farmers overall. So following up on that, how do you envision the future of the digital agriculture and the role of the data management in digital agriculture will look like?
Yeah, following up on my the last question, I think standards amongst the big players in agriculture in terms of how that data gets stored and accessed, and of course shared, which leads me into APIs. I'm not going to necessarily touch on APIs because there's some good work, I think, going on with different groups, but it's certainly very important for the role of data management in digital agriculture. It's how we can work together. But the big things besides the standards and the data sharing or APIs, I think is, at least I hope to see, and I think I have seen this a lot in the last few years, a transition towards more of a focus on solving particular problems, as opposed to, hey, I've got this cool technology. What problems, how can I use this to, solve some problems? Kind of flipping that around and do more of a grower-centric perspective of, hey, I have this problem. What tools are at my disposal to use to actually address that problem, and the focus being just more on the problem rather than the solution, or more on the problem that we're trying to address rather than on the technology. Yeah, so that's what I think the biggest thing that I at least like to see happening. And like I said, I think there has been a transition because those groups that aren't doing that, they just don't last very long in that form.
Do you have any success stories that you'd be able to share with us about where proper data management has led to economic benefits?
So yeah, I can share some examples. I'm going to preface this though by saying I found it, through my career, I find it very challenging to really quantify economic benefit of doing this versus that, an A/B test. And the reason is because the A/B tests are never apples to apples in agriculture, because of things like spatial variability, temporal variability, really driven by soils and weather. And so it's really difficult to know to know the economic impact of a particular decision. But in general, I think a lot of people have always sort of been on board with implementing precision agriculture. It makes intuitive sense. If we are more precise with our inputs and things like that, it should be, it just makes sense that, okay, there should be some sort of a return. Actually quantifying that return can be challenging. So, one of the more basic examples, or it's turning into a more historical example, is grid-based soil sampling, and just using university fertility recommendations to do variable rate fertilizer application, and there's not, it's not new or anything. There's not a whole lot of really exciting things to say about it anymore, maybe in the 90s or 20 years ago. But still, like, this practice we found it doesn't necessarily mean a decrease in fertilizer applied. It's just a better allocation of those fertilizer resources to the areas of the field that we expect there to be the most return or the most bang from the buck. So that's an example that's maybe more agronomic in nature. When it gets into, as it relates to agronomic modeling and some of the things that I've been talking about thus far, I think, something that I'm super interested in seeing future research on is maybe sort of challenging some of those state level university recommendations, because if you ever look at the data, there's a lot of variability across the state or across the region that fertilizer recommendation is made. And so I think with good farm management and good data management, you'd be able to turn each individual farm into its own research lab, if you will, to be able to make specific fertilizer recommendations using the same general practices, the same general statistical techniques that universities use across the whole state, but really focus that on into a localized level. And this is one step that we could take from that example of variable rate fertilizer application, making nutrient recommendations and fine tune it. So yeah, that's an agronomic example. Another example that's maybe more economic based and less, it certainly includes the agronomics, but the decision is just being a yield prediction model, and we want to know the expected yield for every field across a region so that we can understand how much grain we'll have. And so we might have contracts in place, and if we don't fulfill those contracts, we have to pay back. And so knowing the expected yield across the aggregated yield across all of our fields helps us to know, are we going to be able to fill that contract? If not, we have to line up new contracts or find new fields so we can fill our own contract. And if there's a surplus of grain, we might have to find a different market then to be able to market that. And so doing that at a really doing a good job of that can make a huge difference financially in terms of a business's profits.
Yeah, I think those are some of the great insights. Although, as you mentioned, we cannot quantify directly in terms of numbers, having the diversity in field conditions and other aspects, but those examples I think were really helpful to understand the scenario of how this data management can lead to the economic benefits. So following up on that, you previously also mentioned some of your thoughts and envisioning of how you see the future of digital agriculture. So I'd like to ask here, what are you most looking forward in terms of the future of data management aspect from an industry perspective?
Yeah, I don't know. It feels like, yeah, I understand the question. It's a really hard question to answer. I feel like there's just so much work to do that, I don't want this to be doom or gloom or anything, but there's so many things, so many building blocks that I feel are yet to be put in place and utilized to be able to really achieve the value that I'm most excited for. And so, to answer your question, what am I most excited for? I'm most excited for a future or a reality in agriculture where we have a plethora of data at our disposal. Of course, following good security measures and keeping the data only accessible to those that have the rights and the privileges to access that data. But I don't just mean, here's all this data that's being collected, because I think we've for over a decade now we've been doing an excellent job of collecting gigabytes and terabytes of data. It's not about gigabytes or terabytes. It's more the more boring facets of agricultural data. Things like what crop was grown on what field, when was it planted, what inputs were put on that crop on what dates, and what equipment or general management practices were used to make that application or to harvest that data, and really honing in on the spatial and the temporal accuracy and the precision of that data. All of that, it's sort of the more boring parts, and I think that's why it hasn't gotten much research attention, frankly. It also doesn't necessarily support venture capital money from startups and things like that. But I think that's a really critical piece to being able to do really influential feature engineering. I used that term earlier, but feature engineering just meaning taking primary data sources and combining them to construct agronomic features that are relevant to the problem that we're trying to solve. What am I really looking forward to? I'm really looking forward to talking to a new customer, a new potential customer, that all of that it's already sort of expected that this is the the price to play the game, or we have to have a good data management strategy to do these more interesting things around a customized prediction model, or a model that we can use to make inferences about causality of a problem. Currently, most of the time, quite frankly, is spent, sort of describing that, hey, this is a program that tends to be long term, season over season, and the more data that we can collect, and the better we can organize our data, the more value it will bring next year and the year after. And quite honestly, it's sometimes somewhat demoralizing. By the time you expend all that energy to do the data management, there's not a whole lot of energy or willingness to do a lot of the more interesting things. So I look forward to a future where I guess this is better understood, and then that we can basically have historical data to solve problems right now, rather than say, oh, we need data next year so we can do this again next year, because that's a never-ending cycle.
That's great. If our listeners have any questions or want to learn more, where can they go to either get in contact with someone or to learn more about Sentera's products?
Yeah, so I think the best first place to go would be our website, Sentera.com, and there's chat boxes there, so you can get in direct contact with our sales team from there. And then also we are, we're on LinkedIn and Twitter, I know, although I'm not super involved with that, but I know you'll be able to find us there. Of course, feel free to add me on LinkedIn, Tyler Nigon, and I'd be happy to point you in the right direction or continue this conversation.
Yeah, thanks for sharing those contacts. Is there anything we didn't talk about today that you might want to add or mention to our listeners?
I think, well, I think just one last point. I kind of just following up on that last question. I think there's one, just to put it all into one concise conclusion. I think just a recognition that data that is being collected now in 2023, next year in 2024, if you do a good job of it and sort of have a goal in mind of, just generally, hey, I might want to use this data for a yield prediction model to help me contract my grain better, or maybe it has something to do with nutrient management or something like that. But the data that we're collecting right now will be very valuable a decade from now. And the thing that I just want to emphasize is like there's a lot of times this philosophy around, if I'm making an investment in collecting this data and I don't get value out of it in 24 hours after it's collected, it's not worth it to me. I get it. I totally understand that perspective, but I would encourage those listening to have a broader mindset in terms of the long-term value of this data. I know we all have to make our decisions about what's financially feasible right here and now, and we want to get immediate return on that investment of collecting the data. But I'm here to say there's more to it than that, and that should absolutely be considered.
And our last question for the day. So we have a tradition here on the FarmBits podcast, and it's to ask for a piece of advice. So what advice do you have for producers who want to step towards a data-based farm management program?
Yeah, absolutely. I like that you asked that question. I think it's in the same vein as the last two responses, last two questions, and I'd say think about what you want 5 years from now, or what you want 10 years from now, and I'd say don't necessarily expect there to be an off-the-shelf solution to address the problem that you want solved 5 years from now, 10 years from now, next year, whatever. I encourage you to sort of look at this as a team-based approach, using different players in our industry, in the agricultural industry, from university to some of the bigger fertilizer, chemical, seed companies to the startups, or the smaller companies that are maybe more data driven rather than chemical or product driven, that you can touch and feel, and look at it as a team-based approach, and how we can all do our part to take baby steps towards to get into what we want. I think I've seen too much. It makes me frustrated at times, where there's an expectation from growers, from crop consultants, even researchers, that hey, what new product does Sentera have to offer this year? I want to sort of test it out. And okay, yeah, we do that. You have to do that, and we have our products, and they have their place, and a lot of them provide a lot of really meaningful information. But this philosophy around here's an off-the-shelf product to meet your very specific solution problem on this soil with this management practice, this experiment, whatever it might be, it's not really that practical to think that way. And so this is where bringing your own data to the table, and forming your own sort of objectives for how you want to set up and solve a problem, and kind of just coming at it from a team approach, and let's kind of come together more to help design the solutions that we will have next year, in 5 years, in 10 years. So just a broadening of perspective in that nature, I guess, would be my advice.
Thank you very much to Tyler Nigon for taking the time to join this episode of the FarmBits podcast. It's really exciting to hear about the amazing works that Sentera is doing in terms of agricultural data management and analytics. One of my favorite parts of the episode was the idea shared by our guest that the data we are collecting now will be more valuable after next few years.
I agree, but one of my favorite parts of this episode was hearing more about the products that Sentera has to offer, and how producers can still use these products even if they don't have their own drone. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we look forward to sharing another digital ag story with you next week on FarmBits. Thank you for taking the time to join us today on the FarmBits podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts to be informed about the latest content each week.
We welcome your feedback. So if you have comments or questions for us, please reach out to us over email, on Twitter, or in the reviews section of your favorite podcast platform. Our contact information can be found in the show notes.
We would like to thank Nebraska Extension for their support of this podcast and their commitment to providing high-quality informational material to members of the agricultural community in Nebraska and beyond.
The opinions expressed by the host and guest on this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the views of Nebraska Extension or the University of Nebraska-Lincoln.
We look forward to you joining us next week for another episode of FarmBits.